Okay, so welcome back to Advanced Algorithms. Now, today we'll discuss an interesting topic, uh, game theory and Nash equilibrium. You may ask yourself, what is game theory, and how does it, and what are Nash equilibrium? So, uh, when we say game theory, we don't mean essentially how to play computer games. Uh, what we mean is actually how to play games of strategy. So, you may think that game theory possibly you've never actually seen it, but you can actually be rest assured that you've probably used it to some extent. You just may not have known that's what it's called. So, for example, if you think of the game of chess, the game of chess essentially consists of a 8 by 8 uh, board, and essentially you need to determine which chess piece to move and where to move it to, and essentially which movement gives you the maximum possible benefit. And so it's actually a game of strategy, and so it's not just it's just these little fun games that we have for people. It's actually uh, anything that has rationality or that can strategize how to optimize its decision making will actually exhibit a game theoretic behavior, something we can analyze. And so you may think, okay, how do I use this in computer science? Well, the best context I can give you is the most reliable one is think about essentially uh, think about a resource allocation system where you want more resources and you want to know how to get them without paying a lot of money or something like that. And really, what it comes down to is you're trying to manipulate the behavior of the other players or the resource allocation system to give you more resources for a cheaper per resource cost. So this could be memory if you're a program, bandwidth if you're uh, this could be memory, bandwidth, as in speed, uh, storage, etc. So all of these actually are quantities that can effectively be bid for. And actually, you may have used you may have actually uh, indirectly used game theory. If you've ever bid on an auction site such as Yahoo, eBay, etc., these are actually game theory type. You're actually playing a game. You're bidding for something, and you're actually and the price you're willing to pay is essentially something you strategize. How much is it worth to me? And the price that you're charged is based off some rational understanding of how the system works. And so, actually, uh, if you if you've actually ever used an auction website, you'll have encountered something called auction theory, which is a subfield of game theory. And so each strategy type, as in what action we should play, determines how we account for other player strategies. So if, for example, we know that if we bid, let's say, the if we bid, let's say, the most amount of money that we're willing to pay for something on auction website, but we know we'll never actually pay that much, then that may be our best strategy to bid our maximum value. But if we know that, we will be responsible for whatever we bid for, such as a first price auction system, then we will essentially bid the minimum amount possible to win. And so there'll be potential payoffs we have based on the strategy we have. And these payoffs can typically be measured in terms of what we get in exchange for how much we're willing to pay. And there are, of course, incentives that you can have in the system to encourage certain behaviors. And we'll actually see several examples of this and explain more details of this in today's lecture. We'll see how far we get because this week we're covering essentially game theory, Nash Equilibria, and next week we have a final review which will cover the oral presentation as well. And the final review is actually quite long because it's not just a here's topics we'll test. It's more so a like summary of the course. Uh, so here's examples of game theory. So you probably didn't know it was called game theory, but uh, these are actually well-known examples. So stock markets, commodity markets, or other markets are essentially people such as stockbrokers, you, me, who has an account, bidding for stock at a certain price, or trying to ensure that we don't lose too much money. So stock markets essentially are one form of game theory that we see that's used in real life. Another one is advertising. Now you may say advertising. How does advertising use game theory? So uh, if you've ever used a search engine, which I think most of you have, you'll notice that the order of the ads and which ads appear in on the search results, they're not random. They look random, but they're really not that random. And what you start to realize is that in addition to the cookie that's tracking you and targeting the ads to you, the order of the ads depends, essentially effectively determines how effective they are at getting your attention. So ads that are closer to, let's say, uh, the top search results have a higher click-through rate or impression than ads that are at the bottom. And so ultimately, what we see is advertisement is actually advertisers will bid for uh, advertisement slots, and this effectively is a game theory problem. It's actually auction theory. Social networks is another type of game theory where essentially you want to know if you want to influence, let's say, a large group of people, how many should you influence, who should you influence to actually effect that. And so social networks actually are a measure of how effective we are in terms of spreading information. Network routing, essentially, if we're trying to determine what is the best path to traverse, or we want to bid for bandwidth or speed or optimize over these, it really comes down to a game theoretic analysis. So what if instead of choosing the shortest path, what if I choose a longer path that has a lower latency? So it's a strategic choice. So it's not like Google Maps where it says choose the shortest path to your destination and that's it. If you follow Google Maps directly, chances are that it wouldn't account for red lights. It wouldn't account for the traffic information is often not up to date, so it's not reliable. It wouldn't account for construction. And so you will rationalize, say, well, although I could choose the shortest path between, let's say, here and Taipei 101, that may take 10 minutes longer due to traffic. So network routing will actually also use game theory to strategize what route to choose based off the competition for resources. And actually, one good example, if you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind, it's okay if you haven't, but if you have, A Beautiful Mind has an example with birds, essentially looking for food on the ground. And you may think, how is it birds use game theory? Okay, birds don't understand game theory. But what they do understand is the way they can maximize the probability of finding food is to essentially not crowd together. So to have as much space as possible between them and other birds if they're looking for food. So birds will essentially intuitively realize that if they want to increase the amount of food they can eat or get, then they should actually try to avoid being as close to as many birds as possible. So instead of having this bird here next to this one, it may appear over here where there's more space. And the reason is this increases the amount of area the birds can actually uh, look at and see if there's food. So it's not like they know there's food there, they just think that it increased the likelihood of finding food because there's less competition. And the last example we have is strategy games. So chess is always a good example. Uh, it's it's a game that while I can play it, I'm actually not that good. And grandmasters will actually can strategize 7 steps ahead, and so it's not just 7 steps of if I move this pawn here to over to this location, what happens 7 steps out. Instead, it's what if I move this pawn over here? How does the other player respond to me? How should I respond to him? And how does that impact all my other pieces? This type of uh, this type of essentially analysis is not trivial. So uh, it requires essentially you keep track of the moves and other actions of the other player and say, based off what I expect they'll do, because it maximizes their utility or with their benefit, I should perform some other action that maximizes my benefit. And it's this rationality that leads to the concept of essentially you're not just optimizing based off your own decision, but you're optimizing your decision based off other people's decision, which is dependent on your decision and their analysis of it. So it's this type of back and forth, essentially analyzing opponents and their strategies, which is what game theory is really about. Now, computers are super rational. Computers will say what is the best choice all the time. People, not so much. So people, if they're rational, they wouldn't gamble. But as we all know, if we look at Macau, for example, or Las Vegas, these are two examples of gambling havens. And so people will gamble because they have hopes of winning more. But statistically speaking, they actually lose in the long run. The house always wins. So people aren't in gambling, they aren't rational. Emotions are not rational. If they were rational, then maybe they wouldn't, maybe people wouldn't essentially uh, do things like, let's say, express emotions and such. Instead, they'd be very strategic uh, in their actions. Now, let's see. In terms of uh, logic, people people if they focus on something can be logical. So obviously, you're writing your PhD dissertation or your master's thesis, you need to logically express it. And game theory wise, players are so people can be rational, people can be logical, but not all the time. And ultimately, this is where advertisement comes in and says, how can I leverage emotions to get more money out of you? So now, game theory wise, players are rational. They say uh, game theory assumes that all the players are making calm, cool, rational decisions, not this emotional or kidding yourself or making belief of how things work. And so we ask ourselves then, what is a game? This defines the strategy players can take. So the actions are still decided by the player uh, or agent. So if you've ever had the chance to read any journal papers that discuss agents, it's referring to rational decision making programs. It doesn't need to be a person, it can be a program. And the reason it can be a program is because the strategy space that each player has is limited. It doesn't have a continuous set of decisions it can make, has a discrete set. So these agents can be computer programs, they don't need to be people. And uh, ultimately, it considers other players' strategies and what payoffs they can have. The payoff may not be maximized then. So So pretty much, so pretty much, what we see here is that we can see that we can pretty much see that each strategy we use, actually I'll draw us down here out. So each strategy we have, whether it be short term or long term, leads to an action. And this action influences the payoff that we get. And it may be long term payoff, it may be short term, it depends. In chess, often it's not short term payoff. In chess, you're trying to convince the other player that they're safe when really you're getting them in a position to do checkmate. Uh, so the payoff itself may not always be maximized. In the short term, it may depend on the strategy that's being employed. Now, why should we, as computer scientists or engineers, be interested in game theory? Well, protocol design is one. How do we ensure that essentially, how do we ensure that our system encourages a certain behavior? This is where protocol design comes in. Algorithm design, essentially computational complexity. How can we, from a game theory standpoint, how many strategies do we really need to implement? If an algorithm has a logical choice, then we should focus on that. And and now computational complexity, this leads actually to the core of this course. We ask ourselves, if the solution is good enough with approximation algorithms, why do we need to have an NP hard problem to solve for every instance of the problem? So rationally, we say, if our solution is good enough with known approximation algorithms, we don't need to re-implement, we don't need to run the NP hard one every instance, because we don't need to have the optimal answer. Suboptimal is good enough. In terms of efficiency, game theory is important. So what do I mean by efficiency is essentially when we allocate a resource, who gets the most benefit out of it? That's called social efficiency, or allocative efficiency. Now, something I should warn you all is, if you start looking at game theory documents, what you'll find is that they are mostly centered around politics and economics. And the reason is because game theory is mostly, it started out based off economics. While we attribute this to John Nash, he really wasn't the first person to think of game theory. He just made it popular. And so efficiency deals with, if uh, let's say for example, I'm selling a pair of shoes for, let's say, $5, and each of you is willing to bid some number between 1 and 5 for it. And then we ask ourselves, okay, who should get this? So this would depend on which one of you has the highest value for it. So let's say for example, we change this. Let's say we have shoes that have, I have shoes and you're bidding for them, and each of you bids between 1 and 5. So social efficiency or allocative efficiency says we should give this this product, token, what have you, to the person who values it the most, subject to their ability to pay it. That doesn't mean you pay that much. That just means you value it that much. So allocative efficiency just refers to how much you value it. And this is really what this allocative efficiency comes more into when we have social programs such as food kitchens and whatnot. But it does come into play with computer science when we're dealing with, let's say, radio resources. Or you're dealing with advertisement slots. Who should get what slot? Top of the screen, middle, bottom. In terms of fairness, we ask the following question then. What is fair? For game theory, what is considered a fair allocation? So something which some type of fairness that you may have heard before is maxi min or mini max. Now these, well, you may have heard of these before. Uh, when you actually go through how fairness works in these systems, what you really see is that maxi-min and mini-max really relate to analyzing the strategies of other players and determining how you can maximize your own benefit while minimizing the harm to them or vice versa. And so fairness comes to how we allocate something with respect to someone else and our own interest. So it's not just I'm considering myself, I'm also considering how it affects someone else and how that affects me. Now, if you're interested in getting research published quickly or accepted more easily, then I would suggest considering game theory and adding it to your research because in Mandarin it's 跨领域, but I think in English it's cross-disciplinary, essentially multiple area research is actually very interesting to academics. So, but I should note that if you put game theory on your resume, that probably won't help you too much because it scares people. But it does help getting publications. If you want to use game theory, then I would suggest on your resume or curriculum vitae, however you want to call it, that instead of calling it game theory, just refer to it as optimization. It's really rational optimization, so that's not, you're not saying the non-truth, you're just making it more digestible. It's optimization. That's really all it really is. So, and now we can see an example of this. So we have essentially prisoner's dilemma. So prisoner's dilemma, this is a classic example in game theory. And but before essentially giving away the answer, which says both confess, the thing is, let's analyze it about why, for example, both confess. So what is a prisoner's dilemma? So let's say two people are arrested or brought in for questioning. And the cops say, if you confess, then essentially, then you'll get so many years in prison. If you're silent, and so if you confess, if you get so many years in prison. If you're silent, then you get so many other years in prison. And you start to realize that if you just look at your own situation, you're going to jail. Because your assumption will be that if you're silent, the other person confesses. But if you strategize, then you say, what if we're both silent? Then there's no jail, there's no evidence, right? But what we actually find is that in this case, what the player one or player two is trying to do is to minimize they're attempting to minimize jail time. And no one likes being in jail. Each prison is different. Some of them referred to as essentially clean versions of you know what. But the point being, you want to minimize this number. And you may think, well, why not just be silent? Well, because you're rational. See, all right, if I'm silent and the other person is silent, it's great. We both get out. But if I'm silent, such as player one, I'm silent, but player two confesses, we both go to jail. But player two, because he confessed, only gets 1 year, while I get 5. And we have a similar argument for player two. Player two, if they're silent, then and player one confesses, player one is only in jail for 1 year because he confessed. Player two is in jail for 5. And so you start to realize, you rationalize this and say, really, you should both confess because this minimizes your jail time and doesn't depend on this faith that your partner in crime, if they are that, will be silent or confess. Because if you confess and he confesses, you only get 3 years. If you confess and he's silent, then you only get 1 year. So why would you want to be silent? Because there's no incentive. Because you trust the other person will be quiet, but they'll say, I don't know if the other person will be quiet. And so this Nash equilibrium refers to a set of strategies which can be deterministic or randomized. Uh, and the strategy of one player is the best response to a strategy of another. So player one confessing is the best response, assuming that, let's say, assuming player two confesses or is silent. And the only time that player one would choose silent is if he knew player two is silent. And in reality, we can only know if another player will be silent if by some chance they are unable to speak. So the point being that prisoner's dilemma is one of those situations where you have to consider where each player will optimize their strategy based off their perceived view of the other player. So pretty much this slide just summarizes what we just said. If both cooperate, I remain silent, they minimize your prison time, but it demonstrates, while this is a nice toy problem, it still demonstrates real life problems. So, so essentially, this doesn't have a dominant strategy per se. It has a Nash equilibrium, but doesn't have essentially, it doesn't have a 100% you must choose this strategy. Instead, it has a analysis that says you need to consider someone else's behavior. If you had a purely dominant strategy, because one where you don't need to consider someone else's behavior, then that's actually easier to analyze, but that's not always true. So another example we have here is rock, paper, scissors. So I don't know what this may be called something else in your home country. So essentially, rock, paper, scissors is a randomized strategy. You don't know if your opponent will use rock, paper, or scissors, and so and we assume that you actually have no idea of their preference of one versus another versus another. So the probability of them choosing rock, paper, or scissors is 1/3 each. And the point where both players have essentially there is a point here where both players have no incentive to change their strategy, and that would be this, where it's 1/3 each. And you may ask why? Well, what if another player, say this player here, said I'll never play rock, so it's always 1/2 of paper or scissors. Then what this first player will do can say, fine, if I know you'll never play rock, what I can do is then always play scissors, because I'll either win nothing if you play scissors, or I'll get 1 point because you played paper. And so because of this random choice, what we actually see is the rock, paper, scissors game, in fact, exhibits a zero-sum two-player equilibrium. And this is only over the long run. So what we find is that this type of strategy is actually these type of randomized games are actually quite common. So it's not just a theoretical. Another example we have here is a classic one that we have, at least in game theory, is the Williams sisters, Venus and Serena Williams, tennis players. And what you see is, don't think I go into this in too much detail, thankfully, but what we see here is that each of these players will rationalize, saying, well, if I'm Serena, then what I'll do is say, well, should I play left or right? And what percent of the time should I play left or right? So this Venus Sisters tennis game is not a always the same strategy. Instead, it's a probability. It's a mixed strategy game because essentially the strategy they'll play will change over time, or will change with some fraction being one versus another. So Serena here, if she says I should play left, let's say 40% of the time, then right would be 60%. But what she'll do is what Serena will do, uh, essentially, will say the strategy that I should play X% of the time is dependent on the strategy that Venus plays. And Venus, I have some belief that Venus will play left so much percent of the time, and some belief that she played right some percent of the time. And so what we see is this is uh, based off this type of game. What we see is if, let's say, Serena plays left, it's random, so you don't know what you'll play before they actually go and choose left or right. So if Serena plays left, then Venus has a 50-50 chance of hitting the ball if she chooses left. If Serena plays left and Venus plays right, then she has a 90% chance of hitting it and a 10% chance of not. So if Serena plays left, Venus plays right, then that maximizes uh, Venus's Venus's particular payoff and minimizes Serena's. So Serena will then say, "Okay, I'm going to right then." And then right then, when she goes to right, if Venus keeps playing left, then pretty much it will now become there's an 80% chance that uh, Serena can hit with 80%, while Venus can't hit. Well, Venus misses, and so essentially what we'll see is the particular actions Serena and Venus Williams plays will actually rotate around this payoff matrix. So it's not set hard. It must be one this, or it must be left left or right left. It really will change over time and percentage. So there in this game, there is no pure strategy Nash equilibrium because there's percentage of playing left versus right. And there you can actually verify this by saying the left-hand side of this equation equal to the right-hand side and saying them equal to each other. If you want to know the actual theory behind this, it actually involves partial differential equations. But at least if you look at YouTube, what they do is simply set left-hand side to right-hand side. That's fine. But really, uh, really what game theory is solving isn't algebra. That is just a simplification. Really what game theory is looking at is the gradient of payoff. And so that's why we use partial differential equations to actually solve this type of problem. But this just points to the fact that choosing which strategy we have depends on the particular strategy of someone else. So a Nash equilibrium is actually a pair of n-tuple strategies for two players. There can be more than two players, but to date, we haven't found, at least research to date, has yet to have substantial conclusions about more than two-player games, uh, at least in terms of determining how to determine the best strategy. So what we see here is that Nash equilibriums they actually occur because what they essentially guarantee is no single player can benefit as an increaser payoff by deviating from a utility maximizing strategy. So a Nash equilibrium can pretty much ensure that a Nash equilibrium can pretty much ensure that these systems are in fact, as we say, incentive compatible. You will play a certain strategy because if you deviate, your utility decreases, so you won't deviate. And so Nash's equilibrium was that every finite game has a mixed randomized Nash equilibrium. Now you may ask yourself then, okay, if an equilibrium exists, how can this be computed? So if we see here, prisoner's dilemma, they actually have a pair of dominant strategies, confess, confess. But what you saw is that while it had this dominant strategy, confess, confess, the thing is people aren't rational. So prisoner's dilemma, the reason we said essentially confess, confess was a dominant strategy was because people aren't rational. If they were rational, they'd be silent. Then they have no jail time. And police could use whatever technique they want and still get no confession. But as we all know, when as we've seen, when people are arrested, they pretty much panic. Some people may panic and not respond well to being interrogated. But for prisoner's dilemma, there's only one pure Nash equilibrium, but there may be multiple Nash equilibrium, such as the Serena Williams game. For rock, paper, scissors, disputing the strategies of which one, rock versus paper versus scissors, as Nash equilibrium, is actually maximum. And this solution is actually minimax. Now, an easy way to remember minimax, since personally, over the years when I initially started studying this, I also found maximin and minimax confusing. Minimax just says you minimize your maximum loss. And maximin says you maximize the minimum gain you can get. So now, because essentially I've been talking about game theory for a good 30 plus minutes here, let me step back and give you some context of how maximin and minimax really connect to our systems of resource allocation. So we have this concept called max-min fairness. So you may think, okay, I've heard that somewhere. Where have I heard that before? Operating systems. How do we allocate CPU resources to jobs such that it's fair to everyone? And how do we ensure that we get truthful information for our resource allocation mechanism? And this comes down to max-min fairness. Max-min fairness essentially says I allocate resources to the person that requires the least first. And this ensures I maximize the efficiency of the resource allocation. So max-min fair is typically used in network resource allocation, computer CPU job allocation, allocate resources to the user with min demand. And you may ask yourself, why? Why would I do this? Well, here, if your goal is to maximize the number of requests that have been fulfilled, then max min fair will essentially maximize the number of requests that you have satisfied. If we assign resources to the job that require the most first, then we could have starvation occur for resource allocation. And starvation in the CPU world means that a job may never get resources. And there's multiple strategies you can employ to ensure that this changes over time. So, for example, typically what we do for resource allocation is we actually change the weights of the jobs over time. So the longer you're waiting for resources, the higher your priority is, and this can help ensure that even if your required resources are more than everyone else, eventually you'll get resource allocation. So we actually do see game theory being used just in other contexts in multiple areas of computer science. And now a brief background or primer on this was game theory was actually the first known discussion was back in 1713. So about 230 some odd years before Nash, John Nash, and his uh, publication, his PhD. And back in 1713, minimax mixed strategy was discussed. Then in 1838, this Antoine Augustin Cournot discussed duopoly, essentially two companies competing, and what national equilibrium they can exist. And then in 1928, von Neumann essentially discussed compact convex sets. Do you see where this is now connecting to optimization? And you may ask, how does it connect? And think, what is a solution space that can exist? What is a payoff? What is a payoff space that exists that corresponds to a convex set? And so national equilibrium just formalized this more so and just talked about non-cooperative games. But was John Nash the first to talk about this? No. Was he the first one to talk about in the context of non-cooperative games? The first well-known one, yes. So, point being, although we ascribe equilibriums and strategy games to John Nash, they did exist. This concept did exist long before he existed. And and these slides I haven't had changed for some time because they're actually quite effective. So don't mind the date, mind you. So if you look at strategic games, then we actually start to see something interesting. So we actually start to see strategic games yield matrix games. And these matrix games can represent payoff values. So if you look at payoff ordering, then we say, okay, what is this? Well, so these matrices represent payoff values, and we have payoff ordering of essentially which potential payoffs are higher than others. And players essentially move simultaneously. So when we see a matrix, something like this, so it's like player one, you have left, right, player two, left, right. What this matrix is saying is player one and player two move simultaneously. This does not mean they actually move at the same time per se. What it really means is when they move, they don't know what move the other player has made until both players have moved. So you can't analyze the other player's strategy and then base your strategy, what strategy you will execute in this step based off what they've done in this step. You have to wait until the next time step. So pretty much simultaneous movement just means you don't know their strategy until you moved. And so, and this game in normal form, this matrix here is called normal form, was actually more formalized by von Neumann and Morgenstern. So here's actually the normal form of this game. This should help formalize what we've seen before today. So essentially, these are payoffs you have. So if player one plays strategy A, then he gets this payoff, either this one or this one, depending on what player two chooses. If player two chooses strategy A, then player one gets this. If player two chooses strategy B, then player one gets this. So this payoff matrix is just saying, if I choose a strategy, how much do I get paid? And what we see is, in terms of notations and definitions, a strategic game, G, has n players. And for each player, a set SK of pure strategies exists. And what this actually corresponds to is a strategy space. So let's say you have two players and they each have 10 different strategies they can execute. So our strategy space consists of 100 different possible outcomes based off the strategy chosen for two players. And this can be extended for n players. So as you can see, it's actually a exponential problem, and it's essentially n to the k, so it's exponential. Actually should be, so actually it's k to the n in terms of solution in some of the strategy space. So each strategy will have a corresponding payoff, and this corresponds to our solution space. So what you start to see quickly is using things like dynamic programming and such. It's nice, but it's not feasible. Not when you have many players or many strategies to consider. And so for each player, their utility function, UK, maps SK to payoff. And this payoff essentially says, okay, I have this utility function based off of strategy, and that's what I'm trying to maximize. And so for each, this could be profit, it could be airtime, whatever you want to say is your utility. And if you happen to check textbooks in game theory, many of them are not written for computer science people. Instead, they're written in the context of economics and political science. So, as a fun little side story, back when I was in NTU, I thought it'd be interesting to audit a game theory course in the business department. You can imagine how fun this was. Not really, because in computer science department, or EE, they talk about engineering problems. Guess what they talk about in business? They talk about competition between countries. And one example they have was about war. So, uh, I didn't have the background for that, but so I chose the EE version of game theory that was more relatable to my background. Pretty much what we see is that the textbooks we use either this notation, that's I think it's called Blackboard R. So if you want to think, this is what Math BB in LaTeX world, and or PyK. So PyK is actually, if you've ever looked at optimization material before, pi is actually a representation of the payoff. And so there's actually two possible equilibriums we have. Is pure strategy Nash equilibrium is an equilibrium where each player plays one specific strategy, or mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, or an equilibrium where at least one player chooses with some probability, possibly randomly, over a set of pure strategies. So really, mixed strategy Nash equilibrium just says you are choosing with some probability some pure strategy. And so if we go back at this to our prisoner's dilemma, what we see is here's a payoff matrix again. Now it's a similar context. In fact, this could be some authoritarian country where essentially they say you're going to jail. It's just a question of how long. But point being, the payoff matrix. If we look at this, we have two players, player one and player two. What is a strategy space is player one plays confess, player two plays confess, one confess, two silent, one silent, two confess, one and two both silent. So the two strategies per each player based on this space alone. And the payoff function ends up being dependent on strategy a player and their opponent's play. So this can ultimately say strategy. So this ultimately says your payoff here, U1, depends on. So U1 is player one's payoff, depends on their strategy and the strategy of the other player. So then I start to think to yourself, what my payoff depends on strategy of another player. So how do I maximize my utility? And that's where rationality comes in. And there's actually another interesting way of viewing these this type of matrix game is we can view it just for one player at a time. Now, what we see here is in any game, there's always a finite number of players. Bidding, talking to cops, social networks, what have you. When there are two players, you can use a matrix to write down the payoff function with respect to one of the players for constant sum games. So, for example, in this even odd dice game, where player one rolls even, player two rolls odd, it's a zero sum game because essentially we can tell this right now it's zero sum because there's the same probability of getting odd or even for both players. And so what we see is given this payoff matrix of essentially I get even, you get even. If so, player one wins $1 if player two rolls the same even or odd that they do, and player two gets $1 if he rolls differently than player one. So even he rolls even, player one plays odd, or he rolls odd, player one plays even. And player one loses money if he rolls even and player two plays odd, or vice versa. And what we see is this type of strategy or zero sum game actually can be represented as potential actions for player one. So this submatrix here just corresponds to the actions and payoffs of player one based off what player two has. So essentially, this becomes player one is here, player two is here, and this is payoff. So because player one doesn't need to really care about what player two is getting paid per se in this game, because it's pretty much it's the same payoff for him regardless. If he tries to, let's say, maximize his payoff by, let's say, a first roll even, I'm going to trick the system, roll odd, then player two will essentially try to do the same thing, and you'll see that the payoffs will oscillate back and forth. And so this leads to the concept of actions versus strategies. Each player has a number of actions that can be performed. The number of actions is finite. The game is then finite. A number of actions are then not bound and are considered discrete. Then the game is, if the actions are not bound, such as I'll give you a good example. An action that's not bound and not discrete, one that I'm sure many of you have actually had is if you're cutting a cake, how much you cut. Where do you cut the cake? Your action, it's not discrete because we're not using a mold to cut the cake. You're just using a knife and that's it. So you're making the cut somewhere, and that determines what your potential portion of the cake is, and that's a non-discrete action. This is an infinite game. So, along with betting, how much money you bet is infinite. While it's countable, such as $1, $2, 1 cent, 2 cent, it's infinite because you have infinitely many choices. Well, up to however much money they're willing to let you gamble. But it's effectively infinite. And the actions and strategies, regardless of whether it is discrete or continuous, is actually it actually points to similar concepts. So In a strategic game, such as a matrix game, the action you perform is the same as a strategy, such as confess or be silent. In an extensive game, we have multiple series of actions, then multiple series of actions based off the strategy you're trying to achieve. One single action doesn't necessarily equate to one strategy. It's a series of actions that comprise a strategy. And so if we go back to our prisoner's dilemma case here, we see there's types of strategies. We have weakly dominant, set of strategies with payoffs equal to or higher than others. And so, for example, for example, a weakly dominant would be if I said, yeah, if for example I said this here was, let's say, 8-8, and this was 8-8, then would say, okay, what's a weakly dominant strategy? So the weakly dominant strategy will be to play essentially to play confess, because well, in this case, I'll put this, if this was a cost matrix instead, where you're earning money, then your strategy would be to say, if this was 8-8 here and this is 8-8 here, then your strategy would be to confess, because that would get you more money than the maximum possible here. So confess would be weakly dominant strategy over silent. Strictly dominant would be where one payoff is higher than all others. So for example, if for example you had this matrix here, say 1-1, 2-2, 10-10, 1-1, so this strategy here would be strictly dominant for both players because both of them maximize their payoff. If player 1 plays the bottom strategy, it's called R, and player 2 plays L, then they both maximize their payoff. If player 2 plays R, then they don't maximize their payoff. If player 1 plays L, he doesn't maximize his payoff. So in this context, 10-10 here would be the dominant strategy. It'd be strictly dominant. And in this case, strategies such as player 1 ever playing left would be strictly dominated by playing right, based off the fact that player 2 would never play right because it's always dominated by playing left. So a dominated strategy is always weaker or lower payoff than a strictly dominant or weakly dominant strategy. And this leads to consequences and preferences. So each strategy combination can be considered a consequence in this prisoner's dilemma. Different players have their own preference for each consequence. So we see here, prisoner 1 prefers 2 years versus 4 versus 8 versus 12. So you have an ordering saying, how much time do I want to spend in the ice cube? 2, which is less than 4, which is less than 8, which is less than 12. And so he's starting to realize, okay, that's my order of preferences. I prefer to minimize my time in the clink, slammer, or what have you. And this payoff functions express preferences. This means we can think of payoff as being negative, less time in jail. So if you prefer to think of a payoff matrix as always being positive, maximum is best, then the way to view the prisoner's dilemma is take all the values and make them negative instead. Then you're trying to maximize it. Because maximizing a negative value is equivalent to minimizing a positive value. And actually, we've seen this before when talking about integer programming. Now, if we look at strictly competitive games, then we see these are introduced by John. These were introduced by John Nauman and Morgenstern. So we have Theory of Games and Economic Behavior from 1944. During this time, work on game theory focused on cooperative game theory. Two players working towards a common goal. A constant sum game is mostly two players. So we see here our utility, our sum of utilities is equal to C. So we're trying to essentially determine how to divide something possibly. And that's a cooperative game. Now, if you look at strictly competitive games, the win of one player is the loss of another. So in this example here, we have a pitcher and a batter. So each player attempts to maximize their payoff. The pitcher is on the opposing team, the batter is on the current team on deck, and essentially, while one player is trying to minimize the first player's payoff function, the other one's trying to maximize it. So essentially, a batter expects a curveball. If he expects a curveball, the pitcher should then avoid throwing a curveball because there's a good chance the batter will hit it. They're competing, remember, not cooperating. And so if the batter's expecting a curveball, the pitcher should throw a screwball. If the batter's expecting a screwball, the pitcher should throw a curveball. And for fastball, he should essentially throw a fastball because it minimizes the likelihood of actually being able to hit it. And what we see is this: is that pretty much it becomes a game of strategy. How one side can maximize the likelihood of the other side losing, while the other one, so essentially the pitcher is trying to maximize the chance that the batter misses, while the batter is trying to maximize the chance that he hits. And for these payoff functions, what we see is that they can be summarized as a piecewise function. So if we denote this by Aij in a matrix, player 1 uses strategy I, player 2 uses strategy J, then player 1 wants to maximize across their entire row of strategy, and player 2 wants to maximize across their column. And player 2 and player 1 will look over all their strategy spaces based off all the other strategies that are possibly played by another player and determine what action can be performed. And now we finally come back to where the math comes into this, not just strategy. So really what our game theory is really doing is looking at a solution space or payoff matrix or payoff space and determining how I can find my maximum for me. And so what we saw in the past was that we have what we saw in the past is typically we try to maximize by using global maximum. That's considering a single actor trying to maximize based off what they have. But when we have game theory, instead we have an equilibrium. So optimization, logical mathematical optimization, is about minimizing or maximizing a function, such as finding the minimum or maximum that can be local or global. The Nash equilibrium says find the saddle point in equilibrium, and depending on the game, this can be the local or global optimum, or it can be neither. So our saddle point here, what it actually refers to, I don't think I have a picture here, but what it refers to is essentially the maximum for one player based off another player's behavior. So in general, Nash equilibrium can either reflect a local optimum or a global optimum. So a local optimum can be a disputed game, such as a network flow game. We have a local Nash equilibrium. You have evolutionary stable states, where the local equilibrium changes over time. That's a disputed game, or global optimum, which is a centralized game, such as auctions, where all players are in their local Nash equilibrium, and that corresponds to a global Nash equilibrium. So you may want to think to yourself, okay, what do you mean by this? So each player has their own equilibrium point, and if each player, and if the end result is each player is in their local Nash equilibrium, as in they won't change their behavior because it's best for them, that corresponds to a global Nash equilibrium. But if some players are not in their local Nash equilibrium, then this will change over time, and eventually, if it ever converges, a case where it doesn't is a Serena Williams case, a Serena and Venus Williams case, where their equilibrium changes over time because they respond to the strategy played by the other player. If they ever converge, then they end up in a global optimum, but it's not guaranteed that they'll converge. So what this ultimately says is something we've been dancing around in this class since day one of this class, is disputed games are easier to solve than centralized games. Disputed games are typically suboptimal with respect to the payoff towards the system compared to a centralized game. Disputed games are tractable typically, while centralized games unfortunately encounter NP hard or intractable problems. So from a computer science perspective, disputed algorithms yield local optimums or global optimums depending on what's possible. They're tractable, as in they can yield approximate solutions to the problem, but you can unfortunately get trapped in suboptimal solutions due to the lack of information. So what is a fundamental aspect of a disputed algorithm, disputed agent, even federated learning? What is a fundamental truth about these systems? You only have access to a subset of the entire system information. And even with federated learning, where you still have a global model that's transmitted to each user, all that it's really doing is letting each agent have a more informed view of the landscape around them. It doesn't mean that each agent will massively change your strategy per se. What it means is that they can make a more informed decision, but they still don't have the entire solution space accessible to them. So, so essentially, federated learning, it's nice, but it still doesn't show the entire solution space to the agents. And so what you end up seeing is a evolutionary game where the strategy employed by each local agent changes over time. So I'll put this here. So federated learning is a type of evolutionary game. It changes over time because it learns stuff. It learns this environment over time. It may converge. it may not converge. It depends. And centralized algorithms can yield global optimum. They can obtain the global optimum if the solution space has it. It can be NP hard. It can be intractable, unfortunately. So you see, essentially, there's a trade-off for us in computer science world. Now, if we look at more details of this, is in the Nash equilibrium essentially originated from what we believe it originated back in 1950 from his dissertation, non-cooperative games. I think, if I recall, if you've seen this movie, that's good. If you haven't, you can. I suggest you can at least watch it and see game theory in action. But I believe there's one scene in that movie where it doesn't apply game theory correctly, though, and that's where John Nash is choosing which girl to date. So that one, keep in mind, you may see a flaw in the strategy he applied, but that's an assignment you can have if you want it. But you can watch a movie, A Beautiful Mind. It at least shows you game theory and how essentially he converged on this Nash equilibrium concept. And a form of Nash equilibrium was first used by Cournot back in 1838, called the theory of oligopoly. Now, this essentially means you have a group of players that are trying to manipulate a market, such as OPEC, the oil and petroleum exporting countries. They are, in fact, in oligopoly. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, but they're essentially a group that tries to control the market. So while you can partially blame them for controlling oil prices, what they actually do is they more so control the supply. And what you find is that if they limit the supply of oil, the price for oil goes up. But at the same time, what they find is that they can't limit the supply too much, because if the price of oil goes too high, demand goes down and they end up losing money. So really, what OPEC does in the simplest view of it is it controls how much oil it produces, because that ends up effectively setting the price based off a supply and demand market pricing. So earlier solutions for games all yield Nash equilibrium, but for non-cooperative games, this is true as well. We can have Nash equilibriums, and for zero sum and non-zero sum, they can also have Nash equilibriums. Note, they do not always exist if there is no stable point. What the Nash equilibrium is actually doing is looking for a saddle point where each player has no incentive to deviate. And so this action profile here is actually the result of a strategy. Employed by each player, and this Nash equilibrium typically refers to a saddle point. And so we have a strategy profile, S star, which refers to the optimum strategy. And what we see is this type of system, this really, if you start to think about it now, you start to realize finding an equilibrium is actually what we've been doing essentially all along in our entire lives, is finding, how do I get, let's say, the lowest price for something I want? How do we get the best A, B, or C in life? And so, for example, if let's say if you or I had the potential to, let's say, let's say, be a politician, then the question would be how much time and energy and money should I sink into being a politician before it no longer makes purpose, before it no longer is profitable to me, before it becomes too much for me. And this becomes a game of strategy. So it's like if you have a family, essentially how much time you spend on work to achieve your career goals versus spend at home dealing with family. And this becomes, it's not something that you or I can answer right here, but it becomes essentially a strategy of balancing one choice versus another to obtain the maximum profit. And each profit or payoff function is dependent on you, the player, not something that I can say per se, but something that is something you determine by yourself. And so each strategy that each player has depends on, or each strategy that each player plays depends on what their payoff function is. And this Nash equilibrium is simply saying, well, okay, here's a point where no one will change their mind, no one will change their actions. It doesn't say that each person has the same payoff function. It's just saying that each player has reached a stable point or saddle point for all the various strategies that can be employed. So, for example, if you have choice of, let's say, working on on a, uh, a shipping, was it on a cargo ship, being at sea for 6 months a year, and getting, let's say, getting 3 times the average pay in your country, that may be profitable for you for a certain period of time, but depends. And if you look at a comparison of equilibriums here, we can see Nash equilibrium does not mean there's one equilibrium. There can be multiple equilibriums. So a single equilibrium says that people will perform just that one. So here it's both confess, because it is the it is essentially, in this case, the maximum benefit to them. This could be, so I'll give you an example here. Instead of saying now prison time, this could be, since we're saying here maximizing here versus minimizing, this could be lottery ticket, possibly. So if both people say, here's my ticket, then they both get, let's say, where this value is here. But if one of them's silent, uh, if one of them's silent, I guess not a good example. Let me change this here. Put this backwards. So if it's prisoner's dilemma, then yes. If they're both confess, then they get 8 years. If they both silent, they both get 4 years. Could be an authoritarian country, such as insert country name. I won't say which one because I don't want to discuss politics in this class beyond the context of strategies. And so, but if, let's say, one confesses, the other one's silent, then, pretty much what we see is that there's one strategy here. Both confess because it minimizes their time behind in a jail cell or a luxury resort where you can't leave, depending on which country you are imprisoned in. Some prisons are better than others, so this may vary. Now, it could be there could be multiple equilibriums. So, for example, let's say you want to watch baseball, but your significant other wants to watch theater. Now, that would say pretty much, if you always say baseball, fine, it's good for you. You watch baseball, they watch theater. You both get nothing out of it because going to some event is pointless if you go by yourself. But let's say, for example, that that essentially it could be that both of you essentially agree to swap it, to negotiate how much time you spend on each. So the boy, for example, here gets a 2 from going to theater. He doesn't like theater, but he enjoys time with with this girl, and the girl enjoys theater, but at the same time she's going to go to a baseball game. She doesn't enjoy baseball, but she enjoys spending time with her boyfriend or what have you. So you see, essentially here there's multiple equilibriums that can occur. And what we see is that Nash equilibrium doesn't mean there's one potential point that is the equilibrium point. It could be many points, and it depends. And another example here is game chicken. Chicken essentially, if you haven't heard of it, is essentially two drivers driving their car towards each other on a single lane bridge, and they want to know who swerves first, Bill and Bob. And the possible outcomes are both crash, one swerves, the other passes, or both swerve. This is an example of an anti-competitive game. So, and there's multiple equilibrium. If they both drive on, they both crash, they both lose. If they both pull over, they don't really win. But if one pulls over and the other one drives on, then they win. And this is just an example of while we can analyze which strategy one player would have versus another based off, let's say, their interest in racing and such. Really, what this game is saying is there's two equilibriums that are possible here. And so it could be that, let's say, that one pulls over and the other drives on. So pretty much both drivers will never drive on, because if they both drive on and crash into each other, they can't compete in the future and may suffer horribly, maybe be in a hospital for a period of time. They won't pull over because there's no point in competing then. And so in this game, what we see is driving on and pulling over is quite common, is actually a strategy or equilibrium for both players. And it's just a question of which one. Now, if we look at Maximin and Minimax, what we see is we consider a two-person zero-sum game in strategic form. And this payoff function has, for role player Aij, he has a certain payoff. And this represents essentially the role player's ith choice and the calm player's jth choice. So assuming P1 is attempting to maximize gain and P2 is attempting to minimize loss, this is a zero-sum game. So essentially, P1 is essentially saying, okay, I want to maximize the amount of benefit I get out of this, and P2 is trying to minimize how much they have to pay into this. So so pretty much what happens is what player 1 wins is what player 2 loses. So think of it as a transfer of utility, and that essentially says what this game is really getting at. And so pretty much player 1 is trying to maximize how much he gets out of this action space, and player 2 is trying to minimize how much they lose to player 1. So note what I said here. Player 1 tries to maximize how much they get from player 2, while player 2 tries to minimize how much they lose to player 1. So this type of game is actually quite common, and what this game is saying is one, it's not simultaneous. Two, it's actually a stage game, as in it's a series of games, and at each stage of the game, each player will essentially, well, I'll put this. I should actually say it's just a stage game, because it can actually be formulated as simultaneous decisions, but it essentially says player one and player two will make a decision based off their analysis of the other player, and uh, and what it really comes down to is who is running maxi-min and who's running mini-max. So in detail, maxi-min just maximizes the minimum payoff or gain for player I. So this says player I selects a row which offers the highest minimum over all columns. So for player I, it says A, B, or C. I choose the row which has the highest minimum. What is the minimum of A is 0, B is -3, C is -2. So I choose A because it maximizes the minimum gain I'll get. And minimax then says the regret for J, regret being how much they lose. So he's trying to minimize his maximum regret. So player J chooses a column with the lowest maximum. So what's the maximum for A here? For column A, it's 4. For B, it's 0. For C, it's 2. So what player J will say is, I'll play strategy B because that is the minimum of the maximum loss I can incur or regret I have. And player I will say, I'll play row A because it maximizes the minimum amount I make from this game. And really, this yields a Nash equilibrium of what strategies they play. It just happens for this payoff matrix that this equilibrium or saddle point is a payoff of 0. So player J loses nothing, player A wins nothing. But it's not guaranteed because it depends on each payoff matrix here. It's just for this particular case that the saddle point is 0. Now, maxi-min can be referred to as a security strategy. So first, essentially for some player running maxi-min, they first find the minimum utility for other players. How do I minimize the benefit other players can get from this over all the strategies they employ? Then how do I maximize my benefit over all strategies I can employ? So this is player I is trying to maximize their payoff given the strategies that are trying to minimize J's benefit. So maxi-min for player I is the largest payoff that a player can guarantee themselves without knowing the strategies of other players. So for maxi-min, this says essentially that player one has let's say if they have U here, they have 2 strategies they can employ up and down. Player two has strategies left and right. Then player one will say, okay, if I look at strategies that player two will have, essentially I say player two, I'm trying to minimize his benefit here. And so the minimum for player two's potential payoff is -5 if I play up and -10 if I play down. Then I'll say, based off that, how do I maximize my payoff as essentially player one, which is the second entry here. And he'll say, I try to find so I'll say, what essentially is a payoff of this particular entry here? And so I'll say, well, if I chose -5 here, then I'll get a payoff of 1. If I'd chosen, and if I'd chosen 5 here, then I get 0. And so what we see is that pretty much if we look through this matrix here of essentially trying to minimize the regret or minimize the if we look at trying to minimize the benefit of one player and then try to maximize our payoff based off that, then we can see that actually our our uh, our pure strategy Nash equilibrium would be D and R. Now you may say why. So if player 2 had played R, based off his analysis that we would play U, R would essentially be the best benefit for him. And based off, and if we had played D, so based off the fact that player 2 says, if I play L, then player 1 will essentially say, then he should play U. Then I should actually play then R, as it actually says essentially this this gives me the minimum regret possible. Because let's see how to put this here, because I want to make sure I make this clear. So player 1, player 2 here. So essentially, if player 1 had played U here, then I should play R because that maximizes my payoff. If player 1 had played D here, I should play R as it maximizes my payoff. And if player so this is player 1, this is player 2 saying what player 1 should play. And for max min, what we say is, or we try to minimize the payoff for other players, such as -5, -10 here, and we're trying to maximize based off that. So pretty much what will happen is player 1 will say, okay, I know that player 2 will think the minimum regret that he can possibly have here is going to be R here. Did I make this correct here? So player 1 essentially is saying max and min for U and R. So he's essentially trying to minimize the payoff that another player gets. So player 2 will essentially say, okay, I want to minimize his payoff. So that will say player 1 should play U then if, and then maximum payoff for player I is the largest payoff that player can guarantee himself without knowing the strategy of the players. So let's see. So if we said player 1 here, then player 1's max min would essentially try to minimize the payoff of player 2 and maximize his payoff based off that. So minimize payoff of player 2 while maximizing his payoff. So he would play U, and then based off that, then player 2 would say he's trying to minimize his payoff of essentially saying, okay, based off the fact that based off the maximum here, which is UR for player 1, and for player 2, the maximum would be essentially to minimize the payoff for player 1, well, and then maximizing my payoff based off that. So player 1, I should play R because that ends up minimizing his potential payoff, essentially being 4 versus 5. And based off that, then player one will then say, trying to maximize my payoff based off that. I'll put this. So this is in the context of player one. So player two, then we would say essentially he's trying to minimize the benefit of player one. So he'd say, I'm trying to minimize the benefit of player one. So if I choose, let's say, R here, this minimizes the benefit of player one because he would choose, if he chooses, let's say, down, he only gets 4. If he and then player one will say, I'm trying to maximize my benefit based off what player two has. So I will then choose then U, as that ends up maximizing my benefit based off what player two would choose, which would end up being player two would end up saying, I would want to then, if player two chooses R, then I would end up only owing him 1. Or he would only get 1 out of this. So what we see with this is that for Maximin, that UR is our strategy. This is different from the perfect strategy Nash equilibrium of DR. So DR represents here essentially the standard we're trying to maximize based off strategy of other players, while Maximin says I'm trying to maximize my benefit given the minimized regret of the other player. So player one says minimize regret for player two, which they'll try to play. So player two's regret would be minimum if they player two's regret would be minimized if they had essentially played this R here, and then I would choose in U. So essentially, max min is just trying to say how I can make the best out of the player trying to minimize their loss. And so that's a security strategy. The punishment strategy says I want to essentially maximize the penalty that someone else will pay, and then the other player will say, I want to minimize how much I have to pay you. So here essentially players negative I equals J, and says essentially that player two will essentially say, if this is player one here, then player two will essentially say, okay, then I'm minimized only after player one maximizes. So player one will say, I want to maximize my benefit, which will then say, in this case, player one wants to maximize his benefit, which ends up saying, okay, if I look at this strategy, then I'll say, well, if I had maximized my benefit, then will be the minimum loss to player two would be me choosing then, or would maximize my loss to player two would be then choosing D. So essentially what will happen is player one will choose D because he will say he wants to maximize the maximum amount of hurt to player two, because he knows that player two, the maximum amount of hurt he can see is, or maximum amount of damage you can see is essentially choosing D, because this incurs a penalty of 4. And then based off that, player two will say, well, since I know you're trying to hurt me the most, I'm going to try and minimize how much you can hurt me by. And so I should choose then choose R, because R essentially says, okay, R essentially then lets me benefit the most out of this. You may say, why? Okay, so what happens then? So let's say for example, player one had chosen to maximize his utility out of this. So player one would say, I'm trying to maximize my utility. So essentially, I see 5 or 4 based off the other player attempting to minimize their damage, and so essentially player one or player two will essentially try to choose a minimum damage for them scenario. And so player two will essentially say, I choose to play R because if I choose L, what happens is this actually has more benefit for me. So essentially, this punishment strategy is just trying to let player one maximize his payoff, while player two is trying to minimize the benefit that that essentially can be enjoyed by player one. So player two will choose R because it minimizes the profit of one, and player one will choose D because it maximizes the incurred penalty to player two. And so you see essentially mini-max and maximin are more of a tit-for-tat type of game where they are essentially negotiating, so to speak, how much penalty the other should pay or how much benefit the other gets. So in this case, what we see is the perfect strategy Nash equilibrium is DR, which essentially is maximizing for both, while for minimax, it's for player one, it's DR, and for player two minimax, it's UR. So pretty much, if we had employed a minimax strategy game, what would happen is player two would always play R, and player one wouldn't have a choice that would actually yield the best benefit for him, because he would choose then he wouldn't choose U per se, because U would actually not be the best choice for him. He would choose D. So because essentially player two will always choose R in this case, effectively player one will then choose then D, because he knows that player two will always choose R, as player two will always effectively try to minimize the damage that's incurred. So essentially, what we really see is that this type of strategy is player one versus player two strategizing simply about who gets the payoff from this particular game. So instead of choosing U, where player one would get 5 potentially, he chooses D because he realizes player two will always choose R, as for player two, R is a dominant strategy, as R always yields 1 or 4. And so what we see is actually what minimax and maximin really correspond to is it's typically used in zero-sum games. So they're used to minimize the opponent's maximum payoff or gains. So it may not be a transfer of, it may or may not be a transfer of utility. It depends on the game itself. You minimize one's and ends up minimizing one's own maximum loss. So if we look at this game here, player 2 is trying to minimize their maximum loss here in this system. And what ends up happening is player 2, if we look at this payoff matrix here, what we see is that player 2 is actually trying to minimize their loss. So if they were to say, let's say, -10 here, their loss would actually correspond to, they would try and minimize this by saying, how put this, if they have to pay what player 1 wins, then they'll say instead of paying 5, they want to pay just 4 instead. So minimax is minimizing one's own maximum loss. And this means the smallest value that the other players can force the other player to receive without knowing the actions of other players, i.e. the largest value the player can be sure to get when they know the actions of the other players. So maximin is typically used in non-zero-sum games, compared just like minimax, but maximin is trying to maximize the value a player can get without knowing the strategy of the actions of the other players, i.e. the lowest value other players can force other players to receive. Or maximize one's own minimum gain. So actually, I should not say receive here, pay. So pretty much, minimax is trying to minimize the maximum penalty, while maximum is trying to maximize minimum gain. And what we saw here was that minimax was a punishment strategy, while maximum was a security strategy. You can actually go through these examples. Now, these examples here are just for reference, mind you. What really comes down to is you have to look at the strategy space to determine the best strategy. So I can't tell you which strategy is best for generic matrix, other than all you're trying to do is essentially find these points here that course, and these strategy V plus and V minus correspond to one player's particular strategy. And did I say this here? Yeah. And actually, in real world use, we see in zero-sum games, the players are adversaries. So player 1 and player 2 are actually competing. In maximin, this is maximize the minimum gain and is used in resource allocation to ensure fairness. Bandwidth allocation, knapsack, maximize number of items per knapsack. And minimax essentially says minimize the maximum loss. So it's used in AI and helps select the optimal decision. So this example says decision tree and maximum, and this could be machine learning. So essentially, typically, when we look at AI, we want to say what strategy is the best one that minimizes your damage. And this could be games of strategy such as chess, or it could be in this chicken example here. So what is Bob's maximin strategy? He wants to maximize his minimum loss. So Bob wants to or maximize his minimum gain. Sorry. So he wants to maximize his minimum gain. So he'll choose essentially this strategy here, because he'll choose pull over, because this essentially says he's maximizing his minimum gain for Bob. It's Bob's payoff is here. So yeah, he's maximizing his minimum gain. So his minimum here is -1 versus 0, so he'll choose pull over. And minimax for Bob is to minimize his maximum loss. So his maximum loss here is 0. His maximum loss here is 1, so he'll choose pull over. And so for Bill, we see similar matrix. Now, because Maximin doesn't have the same strategy for Bill and Bob, it means that there is no pure strategy Nash equilibrium here. So a pure strategy Nash equilibrium can only exist when the Maximin for player 1 results in the same strategy as the Maximin for player 2. And the same for minimax. A pure strategy Nash equilibrium can only exist when the minimax for player 1 is a minimax for player 2. And so what we see is V minus, which is maximize the minimum gain, is always less than or equal to minimax, which is minimize the maximum penalty. And only when these 2 points are equal does a Nash equilibrium, a pure strategy Nash equilibrium, exist. So, for example, there are 2 payoffs here in the top matrix, essentially V minus and V plus here, and V minus and V plus here. So the first player makes an action assumption, then the second player acts. And essentially, because we see that V plus, which corresponds to essentially player J, and V. So in this case, I1, J1 is maximizer of V minus, and I2, J2 is maximizer of V plus. What we see is for this particular matrix example here, we see that Bill and Bob essentially have these corresponding payoff matrices. And because they don't have the same, because they don't actually have the same values as we saw here, Maximin Bob is not equal to Maximin Bill, there is no equilibrium. So essentially what we see here is these 2 here do not yield an equilibrium because each player's strategy will not be the same. One won't drive on while the other pulls over and vice versa. So intuitively, we can see max, min, and min-max correspond to strategies that will be security versus punishment. And what this yields is that neither of them will actually pull this strategy here because they'll each divert to a different strategy. And for rock, paper, scissors, we can see the maximins of this as well. So V plus we see is the ones in green, and V minus are the ones in red. And so we can see there's no stable point for rock, paper, scissors either. So I should correct myself here. When I said V minus is not equal to V plus, there's no pure strategy Nash equilibrium. What I should have said is there's no Nash equilibrium. The pure strategy would be essentially if we didn't consider max min, A pure strategy, which didn't consider maximum, would just have 0-0 here. They both pull over because they consider essentially the potential loss, and but that's aside. So when does this equality hold? When do we get a Nash equilibrium from a system? As in, when does maximin equal to minimax? So maximin is equal to minimax when their payoffs are the same, or when they choose the same strategy, not the payoffs, sorry. Not the payoffs, but when they choose the same strategy. So in this case, Bill and Bob watch baseball. They end up getting both as payoff because it ends up Bill tries to essentially if this is player I and this is I here at the top and this is J here at the bottom. So Bob tries to maximize his benefit given Bill trying to minimize. So Bill choose baseball, and Bob will then choose baseball based off that. And then this other strategy is where Bill is trying to minimize what the maximum benefit for Bob is. So Bill will say, okay, what is Bob's maximum payoff? And from Bill's perspective, that's this one, 10 here. It's trying to minimize it. So he'll choose then baseball. So in this case, multiple Nash equilibrium can exist, but only in the context of maximin being equal to minimax for both players. In this case, of V minus V plus. And so our saddle point here actually corresponds to something interesting. If we have zero-sum game, we have two players in strategic form, and we let the payoff function be A of ij, where row player is I, row column player is J, and a choice then is a saddle point. If and only if aij is less than equal to aij. So a saddle point here refers to the optimum strategy. So what first to as is the payoff is it's better for AI to follow a strategy than deviate because it'll get lower payoff. And it's better for J to follow a strategy because it actually ends up yielding a lower payoff for it. Now this matrix here, where if J deviates, actually, or this payoff here isn't explicitly obvious based off this equality here, but if J had deviated, so for example, I chose a strategy that, let's say, was this here, this chunk. If J had deviated, such as choosing one over here versus one over here, while this may increase I, this will decrease J's potential payoff. So you may ask why saddle point exists is because of the equilibrium. No player has a benefit to deviate. So for example, I here won't have benefit to change because if he does, J will change his strategy and it'll lower his payoff. So he doesn't see a point in deviating. And likewise, J won't deviate because if J deviates, I will change his strategy. So if either I or J has an incentive to change strategy, then it's not optimum. Coincidentally, this is also the optimum payoff or saddle point here if both for both players if there's no increase for unilateral deviation. So if I star and J star is a saddle point, then the game can be considered to be a value of A I star J star. So all the saddle point simply is pointing to is when we consider actions between two players, what is the best payoff for both of them? Now, regardless of the game size and number of strategies, a saddle point can exist. So it doesn't need to be just two strategies. So here we see 3 strategies for one player, 2 strategies for one. And here's a saddle point here. Here's another saddle point where essentially we have 3 strategies for both players. Here's another one where it's 5 for one player and 2 for another. And then you ask, can a game have no saddle point, has no equilibrium? And the answer, of course, being yes. Think of rock, paper, scissors. Is there ever an equilibrium in that game? No. Why? Because you look at essentially your choices. If you randomly choose one choice, then you get zero sum. If you deviate, and let's say bias rock over paper and scissors, then the other player will sense this and deviate as well and start getting a positive utility while you're getting more negative utility. So in a game of rock, paper, scissors, there is no Nash equilibrium. And as children, when we play this game, rock, paper, scissors, fun game, yes, but there was no, if you play it infinitely long, you would see that there is no winner in it, assuming that there's no bias. Now, if a game has a value v and consequently Nash equilibrium, if and only if if maximin is equal to minimax, and this indicates more than one Nash equilibrium or saddle point exists. So a saddle point isn't unique in that saying it must be only one. There can be multiple saddle points. And what we see here is this nice wave function where there's multiple saddle points in this game. And so what we saw is, in this case, here's an example where there's 2 saddle points. The payoff is the same for player 1 here. For player 1, his payoff is the same regardless of whether player 2 plays left or middle strategy. And as such, it is a equilibrium for player 1 regardless of what player 2 chooses for these 2 center strategies. And these correspond to a saddle point, 2 different saddle points. Let's see. I think, yeah. So if then we can recall that maximin maximizes a player's minimum gain, while minimax minimizes a player's maximum gain. So in the past, when we said minimizing loss, it also means essentially maximizing gain. So I think actually writing it this way will be clear. Essentially, maximin maximizes the player's minimum gain, while minimax minimizes the player's maximum gains. But the thing is less clear as to which player we're referring to. So whichever way you prefer to remember, it's fine. So if we assume that maximin is always less than or equal to minimax. So our maximin strategy, which is what? Our maximin strategy, which would be punishment, is always less than or equal to security. So our claim here then is that maximin here is always less than or equal to minimax, and the way we can see it is essentially say, let's look at this. If there exists a value where maximin is greater than minimax, then there must be an I1 J1 that's a maximinizer for V minus, and let I2 J2 be a minimaximizer for V plus, and I star J star being Nash equilibrium, and that must correspond to our value. But this would only occur when the payoffs are different. So essentially, what this proof essentially is just saying in a very quick context, just to let you at least have an idea of how maximin is different than minimax, is Maximin is always less than minimax because if it was greater than minimax, then that would imply essentially that would imply something which wouldn't be possible because that would imply the Nash equilibrium would occur where we have two different payoff values. So that would occur essentially where a player would rationalize to choose that choice. Let's see. Thinking here. Yeah. So after we go through this Maximin, we'll talk about Pareto optimality. Pareto optimality is actually an interesting concept used for optimization. But yeah, I guess let's finish this portion first. So if we look at maximizing the minimum benefit or maximizing the minimum loss of J, that's equivalent to minimizing the maximum loss of I. As a result, for any two-player game with multiple Nash equilibrium, each equilibrium would have the same value. So, all right, so all this, without asking you to memorize any of these proofs or any of this, all this means is if we have multiple Nash equilibrium, they have the same value. That's all this really, really says. So so in this class, we don't ask you to essentially prove any of this. It's just to give you the awareness of what maximin is, what minimax is, and what its implications are for equilibrium. So what does Nash equilibrium represent? Nash equilibrium is not always the maximum for all players' utilities. It's possibly the minimum, and it's dependent on utility definition. So for Prisoner's Dilemma, was this the maximum? No. 8-8 is not the maximum for all players. It is just the equilibrium of least regret. The least amount of time you can expect to spend in prison, assuming you have no tacit agreement between you and your cohort in crime. Now, if we look at Pareto optimality, we can see that, well, let's first ask, what is, did I draw this here? Let me see if I drew here or not. But I did. Okay. So what is Pareto optimality? It states where a system resources are distributed in the most efficient manner, where one person or group cannot improve without making another person worse. So this answers the question of, can the outcome improve? This is a property, not a concept, mind you, so it's much more concrete. So a Nash equilibrium, here we call it confess, and a Pareto-optimal would be essentially all these red circles here, with the Pareto dominate as in you'll never choose strategy being silent. So if we look here, confess silent is best for player 2. But if we try to improve players 1's utility, or if we try to improve player 2's utility, I know I got that backwards. So if we look here as penalty or regret, this is best for player 1. So least regret for player 1. But player 2 will try to improve its utility by minimizing its time. So what it will end up doing is hurting player 1. But this is still a Pareto optimal outcome. So a Pareto optimal outcome just says it's the best for one player. So indifference being one party is, now if we look at another example, we would see indifference where one party is better off with another selection. other parties' utilities unaffected. So if we look here at a hunting example of stag versus hare, so for one player, one possible payoff matrix, we see hunting stag pays off, has a higher payoff than hunting hare. And so hare you'll never choose because risks dominate. No one wants to get only one, they both want to get three. So while it's a Nash equilibrium that both choose hare, it's not Pareto optimal because both can improve. And this says that we can't directly compare utility, but only outcomes then. So if we see here, Pareto optimal says you can't, both players can't improve their outcomes. And it's also Nash equilibrium because both will choose this outcome. So a pro-optimal Nash equilibrium will can coincide, but what you'll see is that they're not required that that a Nash equilibrium exists with a Pareto. And what we'll see is in terms of while you may have seen or heard of Pareto optimality when looking at other research, in terms of game theory, what it says is if you have a continuous utility function for person A and B, as utility for player A increases, utility B decreases. And a Pareto optimal point is on the border of the Pareto frontier. So all of these points here are on the Pareto frontier. All the points inside of this are Pareto inefficient. On the Pareto frontier, no one can gain without someone else losing. So person A can't improve their utility without person B losing something. Same with person B. They can't improve their utility without person A losing something. If the current utility is not on the Pareto frontier, then it's Pareto inefficient. And so anytime we move from Pareto inefficient to a better point, it's called a Pareto improvement. Now, you may ask yourself what this corresponds to. So let me roll it back and explain to you in the concept of integer programming and mathematical optimization. What did we see was a solution for integer linear programming or linear programming? We saw the solution, which we got from simplex, was essentially when we had a constraint that was when we took our variables to a constraint and made it essentially where the constraint became inactive. Each of those constraints corresponds to a boundary to how much we can make a variable increase or decrease. And so what we really see is these is if our utility is bounded by a series of constraints, every point on the interior of our utility outcome here corresponds to a point where our constraints are not fully we're not getting to the point of our constraints all becoming inactive. So a Pareto inefficiency corresponds to an interior point in our solution space. And as you recall from simplex, interior points in solution spaces are not optimal. So from mathematical optimization, we considered a single player. From game theory, it's multiple player, but it's the same fundamental concepts. And taking this to game theory, taking game theory to machine learning, we see the same concept. If you've studied machine learning, which most of you have, I think I'd venture to say most of you you've encountered machine learning. This Pareto frontier corresponds to a series of choices you can make in your model and outcomes. And so what you want to do is find a point on here which is Pareto optimal because it indicates your best choice based off your observations. Now, I would like to underscore the fact that a Pareto improvement does not imply a loss for any player. So swapping items may result in improvement for both. So, for example, can a Nash equilibrium be Pareto optimal? Yes, it doesn't conflict. Consider shoe swapping. So, example, having two left shoes or two right shoes is useless. You can't walk comfortably with two right or two left. So you want to swap it with your other player. So Bob here has essentially two left shoes. Bill has two right shoes, and essentially they swap them. Bingo. Now they have one full set. Granted, one's blue, one's red, but now they have one left and one right. And each of these corresponds to a Pareto improvement as Pareto optimal, because we don't care about color here. So let's assume that Bill and Bob don't care about the fact they have mixed color shoes. And these correspond to Pareto optimal points. Now, if you look at fairness, a Nash equilibrium actually points to reasons the optimal strategy exists given strategy of others. So optimal strategies reflect Nash equilibrium and are efficiency-wise is a metric indicating how much a player values a resource. So a resource allocation to a player who values the resource more is said to be more efficient. So a Pareto efficient choice is essentially allocating a resource to someone who values it more, and it happens to be Pareto optimal. So if you hear the phrase Pareto optimal and Pareto efficient, Pareto optimal refers to essentially the point where each player's utilities, where the outcome of the system is in fact maximized. So each player's utilities at a maximum, no one can improve it without harming someone else's. Pareto efficient refers to a resource allocation, saying it's been allocated in a manner such that no one else can get more utility out of it. And so fairness here indicates a metric indicating how fair a system is in terms of resource allocation. Think fair share. Maximin is an example. Maximin is pretty much a fair share concept between in resource allocation. So for example, one fun example that I think you could think of here is slicing a pie. When you slice a pie, you want to maximize how much you get out of that pie, or you want to minimize how much you lose to the other person and maximize your benefit. So think of Maximin as pretty much being like you're making a decision that is minimizing the harm to yourself while maximizing your benefit. And now the four basic game models we have here then is if we have that much, how much time we have for this. About 10 minutes to go, so I probably won't go through. I think we may not go through all of this because I think we actually end up getting to extensive games and such. So what I think I'll do is get to pretty much slide maybe 68 or so, and that'll probably be it. So we have the four basic models. Simultaneous decision are strategic games, such as Confess, Prisoner's Dilemma, Venus and Serena Williams, theater versus baseball, but events may be ordered. You have extensive games with perfect information where you know the utility and strategies available to other players and can strategize based off that. Chess is an example of one. Extensive games with imperfect information where you don't know the strategies and utilities of other players. Coalition games essentially is where you have groups of people or entities working together, such as in politics. So if we look at Prisoner's Dilemma in extensive form, so yes, it's simultaneous game, I admit that. But you can still write it down in extensive form. And when we write it down in extensive form, we see that here's the payoffs. And the benefit of doing this is it helps us analyze which strategy should be followed. So we say if we followed silent, if player one followed silent, player two would then if you could trust player two, would follow silent. But if you couldn't trust player two, which most people act differently under stress, they follow confess, and you get a lot of jail time. So player one would say I should confess, then player two would then say, well, if player one confessed, what's the best strategy for me? It's to confess as well. So this extensive game at least lets you think about the game as a series of decisions versus as a matrix. So games in strategic form or normal form of matrix games are played simultaneously. Games such as chess are sequential games. How do we analyze these? How are these games related to strategic form games? So extensive games on graph have a starting point. Then player one makes a decision, ends up at these midpoints, and player two makes a decision based off these. How can we manipulate a player? This leads to the concept of adversarial games. How can we convince someone to perform an action that is beneficial to us? How can we compute winning strategies? What if some nodes have probability less than 1? Think Markov chains. What do you do then? The main point isn't to confuse you or make you think that's just difficult. It's more so to say decisions in games are not binary per se. There may be some probabilistic distribution. And so if you look at chance and information, some tree nodes may be probabilistic. No player controls, such as poker, roulette. These dogs here playing poker. May be difficult to differentiate between positions in decision tree. Making a decision impacts state of information set and all subsequent decision nodes. So if we make a decision and it impacts our state of our information set, all subsequent decision nodes, then what we see is essentially it's not just make a decision and think about just that step. Think about what the consequences are. So here's some interesting example with perfect information. Player one is in orange, player two is in green. So if finding an m-person game with perfect information as a pure strategy, Nash Equilibrium, because you can strategize over entirely. So here we can see if player one, let's say, chooses this strategy, then player two can choose strategy, and player one can choose another one. Or if player one chooses this, player two can choose this, then player one can choose one of these. And what we see is in these type of games, if we start to consider a probability instead of just being a player two will make an informed decision and will make 100% choice left or right, if there's a probability it's left versus a probability it's right, then this becomes a series of decisions that has to be made. And so it means now the utility for then player one would then be that the probability of playing is player one would say, I would choose, so I'll choose left if player two chooses left with some probability, and then I choose right if player two chooses right with some probability. So this utility here is not one time, it's expected utility. So essentially what this says is player one will never choose right if player two had chosen left initially. Player one will never choose left if player two had chosen right initially. And the reason being because it's lower utility. So this information set essentially forms a basis for an expected utility or probabilistic outcome. And so coming back, at least this is probably where we're end is in these applications portion, because there's many slides here, and I just wanted to give you a taste of game theory to at least let you see that it's not just a bunch of hand waving, but it's an analysis of rationality and optimization and how we can think about this from a decision-making standpoint. So if we look at social networks, they all have a graph structure. And the structure of the social network indicates how much information is shared. So, so if by some chance, if we think back to our case I mentioned in this course a lot earlier, Cambridge Analytica, where essentially there's this nice UK-based company that was farming Facebook data to manipulate popular opinion about politicians and influence the outcome of Brexit, Trump election, etc. I suggest you watch a movie if you haven't. It's very interesting and at the same time very disturbing. Essentially, your social network forms a graph, and this has a market or price, and this can actually yield a market or price. Uh, There's a different concept. But so each social network has a graph structure that indicates influence or how they relate. Social networks are very important when determining how things are connected, and it could be a virus floating around or influence. If we look at market and price equilibrium, there's actually some interesting concepts. A competitive equilibrium is where buyers try to maximize how much they get paid, and sellers try to, buyers try to maximize they how much they benefit, or minimize how much they pay, maximize how much they save, while sellers try to maximize how much they sell. So competitive equilibrium says people will pay only as much as other people will pay for a commodity. A price discovery say buyers and sellers will negotiate until matching occurs. So buying a house is typically a discovery process. Now, for the internet and roads, this is a graph flow. So you have packet routing and traffic flow. So essentially you have packets flowing between S and O, and you want to know how much traffic flows between these points. And this yields essentially S flowing to O to P, or S to O to Q, etc. And what we see is all these internets or graph flows actually correspond to strategies. Which path should I follow? So it's not I look at a graph and say I want to follow this because it's minimum. It's I should strategize, saying how much what's the potential outcome if I follow this path. And the reason we actually strategize is because once we send the packet over a VPN or virtual circuit, we have no control over where it goes beyond the initial routing path. And so social networks can be viewed as a graph where people are nodes, links are relationships, and this represents connections, people, news, likes. Topology of the graph can then be exploited. So change people's opinions, adjust the awareness of information, increase the information sharing, and messaging. So pretty much social networks show influence, and it points to this disturbing concept of, can an election be bought? And the answer is yes, it can be if the price is right and you can influence people. So Cambridge Analytica gathered Facebook information to customize campaigns and influence people on Facebook. So they create games and surveys to get an idea of people's opinions, these very innocent things. Then they post news and create false interest, change people's opinions. Influenced Brexit, U.S. election, etc. Debate is it legal? At the time, yes. Was it ethical? Not quite certain. Response, I think, has been mixed at this point. If it was a virus, a social network can say what the impact of an infection is. So, for example, if you're living in a dorm, your roommate gets COVID-19. Because you're in the same room with them, you're in the same social network, you have a high chance of getting it. And people in your social network have a high chance of getting it, and you see where this is going, especially because if we think about this, theory is you can reach anyone in the world just by going 6 steps out in your social network, 6 branches out, and you can reach anyone. In theory, this is what it says. So a virus quarantine is important to prevent the spreading of it because social networks are very easy to spread them. And when we look at the epidemiology or the pathology of a virus, we say, how did a patient get infected? How many did they infect? Who's their next of kin? And what we see is, well, aside from the fact it's 12, so it'll probably end very soon. What we see is this common club interest. So if we look at a game scenario, such as unlimited time to engage in extracurricular activities, and the players are nodes in a social network, and our strategy will be each player likes a random movie. Each player potentially gains an acquaintance, and more links between players indicate more potential friends. So in a common club interest, and the payoff for each player would be a source or destination, such as P1 is here, Q1 is here. So common interest is good, and payoff depends on how many connections you have. So you want to maximize the number of common interests of other players. And what common interest says is if let's say, this here is not a tree. This is just saying we have different players and choices. So if, for example, P has interest in track and field as 30 people, or Ben is 20, or Math is 50, which they go to? What if Q? What if R? So the payoff for switching from Q2 to Q1 is 50. So Q2, if Q2 was initially in track and field, but they desire social because, I don't know, maybe they find high school depressing, it's possible, it can be, then pretty much by changing from track and field, which is a it's an outdoor event, not social as math club, then to math club they get more friends. Of course, that's not really how people choose social clubs, but it says at least how the influence works. Uh, and so this game has many equilibrium, and any shift in any one person's club interest can shift the equilibrium. Uh, so essentially, why, and I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, Q1, let's say everyone shifted away from track and field here and uh, went to essentially math. So P, Q, and R go all the math because it's their maximum. Now, what if instead P, Q, and R had chosen, let's say, track and field, and their choice in track and field caused there to be more interest, a higher number of connections or people in track and field than in math. Then people may shift from math to track and field because it would essentially make it more interesting. So, for example, if let's say math was, let's say, 32, but because P, Q, and R all chose track and field and made it 33, it may cause people to be more interested in track and field than math and enjoy the outdoors more, and it may shift the equilibrium. So what we find is that this shifting between one equilibrium versus another corresponds to an oscillation between outcomes. So pretty much this is at least this is what we had for lecture 10, because I think we won't have much time. We don't have enough time to finish this lecture deck, at least for today. So if we want to continue this, then we can do so next week at let's see, 5:27. So if we want to, we continue from next week from this slide. But what I'll probably do first is go over the final review, because I think that's more important, because it provides both final and project related information. So it'll help you with your presentations, because I was looking at the syllabus recently, and it looks like next week, if we do final review, then your final will be on then the 10th, and then your let's see, then your final presentation will be on 17th, which would then be enough time to grade it. So yeah, next week we'll first start out with a final review, and that's not just like 5 slides. They actually go in detail, reviewing all the various algorithms. So please do dial into that. And if we have spare time, we can continue the slide deck. But mostly what this slide deck was getting at was rational choices essentially make things less obvious when we consider algorithms, and when we consider things such as let's see, approximation. Yeah, when we consider approximation algorithms like this, what we see is that Nash equilibriums are less easy to approximate, and what we find is that we can only get into an epsilon Nash equilibrium. So that we can discuss next week if we have time. But this is more so just for your information and edification or enlightenment of how game theory connects to approximation algorithms. But essentially, for Nash equilibriums, approximation algorithms are actually used more often than you think, because finding a Nash equilibrium for multiple players, like 3 players or more, is actually harder than NP hard. So that we'll discuss next week. This video will post on YouTube. Are there any questions about the material to date? Yes, no? Or have you all checked out? Too much information?
Professor, can I ask one thing? Hello.
Yeah. Yes, yes.
Professor, actually, the presentation will be before 17 or on 17? Like
Eight?
17 is the due for the report, as you said.
Let's see. Let me pull this. Get,
Uh,
hold on. Let me find because unfortunately my computer here crashed yesterday. That was a rather unpleasant thing. So let's see. Uh, Final presentation. Sorry. Oh, I don't like these calendars. Uh, so it's a week of 6/13, and since we only meet on Friday, that's the 17th.
actually, Professor, actually, it was showing some other dates, so I plan my travel on 17. So
So,
I thought,
so if you're going to travel, uh, let's see. Okay, so you're traveling on 17th. Uh, if you want to travel, then say make sure you upload your video on the then before the 17th so we can show it because we'll still at least show the video for each group. If but in general, I do prefer people be in person.
the review will be on 6th.
No. That's the week of 6. That's not on the 6th.
Okay.
That's that week where it says week 17 there. It says 6/6 is the first day of the week. We're actually on the 10th.
Okay, I actually misinterpreted it. Okay.
Now I'll fix that next time, but that's actually just the way Moodle displays it. So, pardonnez-moi. Sorry for making that confusing, but yeah. So, in your case, for your final presentation, send me the link and upload your file before then the 17th. And the final, let's see, wait. The final exam is actually on 6/10. So 6/3 is actually our final review.
Okay.
So 6/10 final exam, it will be online.
Okay.
So yeah, so it'll be online. So probably take home and you'll have to upload it, take photos and whatnot. Uh, Make sure your handwriting is legible. I'm very bad at interpreting chicken scratch because it's not really friendly to read. So final exam will be take home since it's all remote. Uh, you'll have about 2 hours or so, 2 3 hours. So you'll download it from Moodle. Uh, I guess, print it out, and then go ahead and submit it. Submit copies to submit photocopies or pictures of it. Now, if you don't have a printer, let me know. What I'll probably do then is put out a physical copy somewhere in the office, but I don't know if the secretaries will like me though.
Okay, Prof.
So you're going back so you're traveling before the 17th.
No, on 17th.
What time?
Actually, it's morning, 10 o'clock before I leave.
Okay, then just be sure to upload your presentation and so PowerPoint, video link, and report. Make sure it's all uploaded before the 17th, then or before 17th class. Okay.
Okay, Prof. Okay.
I'll put the link on Moodle so you can all access it. So I do prefer that you dial in versus just sending me a video because I know it's tempting to send me a video and say that's it, but I do like question answer sessions. So even if you record a video, still be online to answer questions if possible. If
Yes, Prof. Okay, Prof. Can I ask for an appointment, like to show my work and
uh,
maybe?
yeah, I can arrange virtual office hours next week. No problem.
Okay, Prof. Okay. Thank you.
So I'll send out that information to you on Moodle saying here's virtual office hours. Let me know, etc.
Okay, thank you, Prof.
Or no problem. Any other questions? Yes? No? Okay, so for other questions, I'll post this to YouTube and Moodle, and it should appear there by today or tomorrow. Uh, for the final review, definitely attend that because what I do is go over essentially the high level of how these work, and the final exam just test more so high level concepts versus detailed derivations. Because at this point in your career, you're more so interested in research versus trying to prove things, which is what undergraduates are actually focusing on. So this course is more so about understanding the field of approximation algorithms and how it's useful for you. If no other questions, and see you all online next week. Thanks for attending.
Okay, bye bye, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof.
Sure, no problem.
Thank you.